I would say that all of spiritual experience and religious systems have come from human beings who had kind of extraordinary kind of visions, physiologic challenge in illness or in battle or warfare or what have you. But then they came to realize there's much more of this world. The number of NDEs were very limited until 1968, when doctors developed techniques to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients. And what's happened since then is we now have millions and millions of people around this world who have come back and have seen the incredible richness of our spiritual reality. It's part of what I see is the modern world, through the grace of God and through our understanding of reality, coming into a much richer knowing of our connectedness, of the healing power, of the binding force of love, and how we're all in this together.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Love Conquers Fear. As you know from the last episode, we're still on Eben Alexander week, and I just wanted to record this quick intro to tell you what's going on when you see it jump to the first frame here of us being on stage. So this was recorded at the JAMen's Forum. It's in honor of Bert Kunik. May his memory always be for a blessing. He was truly a mensch in the Jewish community here and always had our back for everything. And really, it's the largest gathering of Jewish men in Texas that he brought together through this forum. And so you're going to see me on stage alongside Dr. Bob Frachtman and Eben Alexander in the middle. And it was really a great conversation. You'll see Bob at some point refer to this side of the room, and what he means are the Chabad rabbis that decided to attend. I know that they really enjoyed it. I talked with them afterwards. They had read Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, and helped talk about the learnings from that book, as well as deep in Jewish literature. And scripture. That's part of decoding what Bob's pointing to. And then one thing I just want to say, I'm 54 now, and it took me until I was right around 52 years old to realize that source is a proper noun. It's capitalized in the Torah, in the English translation of the Torah. Whenever I'm in the synagogue, I just found it fascinating that source is capitalized. You'll hear the word source mentioned multiple times in the discussion, and it's referred to as the divine source. It is another reference to God or heaven or consciousness or the universe, or however you think about this force rooted in love for us all. And so anyways, I wanted to decode that for you as well. Enjoy. Let me just say again, it was such an honor to have Eben Alexander in our home for a few days, to meditate with him in the morning, and to record in this room the first part. So if you miss the first part of Eben Alexander Week, make sure to watch that. It's episode 46, part 1, and onward here to episode 46, part 2, on stage with Dr. Bob Frachtman and Eben Alexander. Enjoy.
Everyone, Rabbi Will Hall from Temple Beth Shalom. Always an honor to be with this group. Promise I won't take too much of your time. We've got a very good speaker tonight, and it's not me. So, in this week's Torah portion, Truma, the people are commanded to construct a mishkan, a portable dwelling place for God. But the verse puts it in a strange way that many of us might be familiar with. Ve'asuli mikdash v'sachanti betocham. Let them make me a sanctuary, and I will dwell among them. Betocham, not in it, the very object created for God, but among them, the people. And Judaism teaches that structures have purpose. They help us to grow, they help us to acknowledge and keep track of what's going on. Whether it's Shalom Austin or any of the institutions around town, we're proud of our spaces and what they allow us to do, to build and to be together. But we also know that the essence of spiritual life resides in relationship, in human experience, in moments we have between us, not only in walls. And so with that is why we come here this evening in so many ways, not only for speakers, but to engage with each other, to be a part of community, and to grow together. And so with that, this evening, I know we'll be engaging with some pretty fascinating things, pushing us as well to think about how our consciousness, how the afterlife, how all of these things that we don't always have a chance to talk about so clearly, like in this case, the presence of God, what it really means and where it might rest. And so with that, I want to hand it back off to Brett to introduce our wonderful speaker and to be able to jump into these subjects.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I'm going to bring Eben and Bob up while I introduce you guys. So Eben has written the most important book on a near-death experience. His personal story behind that, and this actually happened because of JAMen. It was the time where at the end of 2024, I was on stage with John Mackey, interviewing him. The whole story had just come out, which is a great book. You know, his tell-all book about the journey of Whole Foods. And at the end of that, Bob does this beeline for me and John, and he's like, "You guys need to read Proof of Heaven." And my body lit up. I knew that the answer was yes. I know that John also is a deeply spiritual person and really has a lot of respect as well for Eben. And I actually read it the next month when I was in Kerala, India. And Kerala has the oldest synagogue in India in a place called Cochin. And it was just a beautiful place to be. It was where Ayurvedic treatments were invented. I was there actually for a wedding. Our daughter goes to Tulane. She's 21. And at Tulane, it was one of her Indian friends that said, "Hey, my sister's getting married. Would you guys go?" And I always knew the answer was yes. And so there were over 1,000 people at the wedding. It was amazing. But I was in this beautiful state after the wedding of wanting to decompress, because 1,000-person wedding is amazing, but it's a little bit frantic. And I started reading Proof of Heaven. And to be specific, I started listening to it on Audible. And Audible I would highly recommend because Eben reads the book. And you can hear the awe, the deep humility. You can hear the poignancy of some of the most amazing turns that happen in his experience of going into a coma as a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon, you know, one of the top in his field, who mostly had lost his faith. He was kind of a agnostic at that point, you know, and had these patients coming back saying, "Wow, I just saw the light," or "I just saw this," and he would just kind of, like a lot of people, kind of write him off. And I can tell you how much people get written off like that, because I actually thought I'm a pretty open guy and a guy that my friends can really talk to. But prior to reading Proof of Heaven, I had 0 friends who told me about their near-death experience, okay? After reading the book and talking about the book, I've had 11 friends open up to me. 11 friends, some of which have been friends for 10 to 20 years, who open up to me about their near-death experience. Some of the most amazing entrepreneurs in town, the most important experience of their life, where they saw behind the veil and what the reality was that we go to, or we go back to, is a better way to say it. And they did not feel comfortable with me to open up like that. And the reason why is because of the way we're raised, and, you know, really taught. You know, we've had the rise of the rational mind. I love capitalism. We've had the rise of capitalism. We have had the rise of science. There's a lot of things to be thankful with that. But they didn't feel like they could talk to me in that way about something deeply spiritual that happened to them. And that's because other people that they had talked to probably thought, oh, they're just kind of lost it, or they're woo or whatever else. So Eben, being this vessel chose by the divine to be the one to tell the story of falling into a coma powered by E. coli-driven meningitis, which is going to pretty much eat you from the inside, being essentially brain dead, but then getting this incredible tour of heaven and seeing what it's like, and then living to tell the tale. And I think being chosen is the right way to say it, to tell the tale, is what led to the book. And that's what the book's all about. We're not going to cover the details of the book because we don't have time to do that. Everybody here should have a copy of the book. You're given the book thanks to the Koenig family, and so we're gonna dive into spirituality tonight. I hope that you can maintain an open mind and just realize that two things can be true at the same time. I'm a product of science. I created now 6 companies, and my company Data.World was acquired by ServiceNow last year on 7/7. That's actually my divine number. Is interesting timing what they picked for that. And so we'll get into it tonight. But I just want to say it's a huge honor to have Eben here, and I've really gotten to spend the past couple of days with him. Bob and I had dinner with him last night. Really see his heart and his intellect and his knowledge of the brain. So we'll get into that. And I'm going to bring the portion to this of what does this mean for AI? Because right now, that's what humanity is prioritizing the most from a capitalistic standpoint. There's around $7 trillion that's been allocated in the world towards the race to AGI, artificial general intelligence. And of course, the dystopian fears are coming online of, is it conscious like us? Is this the Terminator moment? Is this the Matrix moment, et cetera? So I'm going to bring that because Evan's got a really interesting perspective on that. And Bob is, and he's actually got a very technical background too. He was coding in machine language as a young man. If anybody knows how hard machine language or assembly code is, freaking hard. You got to be really smart to even approach it. And Bob's really going to bring the perspective of us doing this together, of a doctor who's been deeply rooted in the medical profession, one of the best in Austin, who was really moved by this book. And so we're going to get into it, and we're going to kick it off. So thanks again for being here. Bob, why don't you start?
So thanks to everybody for coming. This is one of those occurrences where a little event led to a big event, and the little event was my wife being told at a yoga class at Lake Austin Spa about the book 17 years after it was published, but it's never too late. And she knew that I was interested in near-death experiences, but I didn't know anything about it. But I would every now and then have a patient that that had a cardiac arrest for some reason or other, and I only knew enough to say to them, "Did you see the light?" That's all I could ask them, and I got some yeses and nos, but I didn't know where to go beyond that. But because I had expressed an interest in that kind of questioning, that's why I ended up getting the book. I didn't even know it existed. So just to piggyback on what Brett said really quickly is that I had a patient last week who's 85 years old and had a near-death experience, a reaction to an anesthetic 10 years ago. And now I knew what to ask. So I asked her, and it was a fascinating experience. So just like Brett's saying, if you ask, a lot of people will come out and tell you the whole thing. And the similarities are really incredible between one story and another. Although Dr. Alexander's is a little bit different, and at the end I'm going to get into how his was different too. But the first question is, now that you've had your near-death experience, do you have less fear of dying?
I have no fear of dying. I know that our conscious awareness increases. It actually expands on being released from the shackles of the brain. The brain is a filter, a transceiver that allows primordial consciousness in, but it is not the ultimate producer of consciousness. In fact, a lot of what the brain does is suppressive and not excitatory. So it's very busy kind of toning things down. So inhibitory neuronal networks play a big role in it all. But turns out that when you have the big, inactivation of brain that occurs around the time of death, it's a liberation of conscious awareness into a far grander kind of vision of the universe, reconnecting with souls of departed loved ones, traveling to an exotic realm, ascending up into light. There are many common themes, as you mentioned, that turn up over and over again in all these experiences, and they're not uncommon. That's the important thing to point out. There was the best way to get your hands on kind of the prevalence of these kind of things is a prospective study. And a Dutch cardiologist named Dr. Pim van Lommel, who's a good friend, wrote a summary of his work back in 2000 in the very esteemed medical journal Lancet. And it covered more than 350 consecutive cardiac arrests admitted to Dutch hospitals, and found a 20%, well, it was 18% incidence of NDEs in that patient population. So 1 in 5 is a pretty kind of astonishing number. And the other thing I'll point out about that is these are cardiac arrest patients that we're talking about right now. I would say that all of spiritual experience and religious systems have come from human beings who had kind of extraordinary kind of visions, physiologic challenge in illness or in battle or warfare or what have you. But then they came to realize there's much more of this world. But NDEs proper were not very, although I'm saying that was, those kind of cases were the origin of all this, but the number of NDEs were very limited until 1968, when doctors developed techniques to resuscitate cardiac arrest patients. And what's happened since then is we now have millions and millions of people around this world who have come back and have seen the incredible richness of our spiritual reality and the story to tell. And I would say that contribution by medical scientists to bring people back from cardiac arrest is not an accident. It's part of what I see as the modern world, through the grace of God and through our understanding of reality, coming into a much richer knowing of our connectedness, of the healing power of the binding force of love, and how we're all in this together. I think it's going to be a transformation for this whole world, especially when you realize that there's some very deep kind of scientific basis to a lot of these conclusions.
Thanks. One of the common themes for those of you who have read about this is that even before I read the book, you keep hearing that when you're having a near-death experience, you are escorted by a former deceased relative. And my question to you is, these are from near-death experiences. Do we believe that this is actually what happens with real death?
Well, the best evidence for what happens in real death, I can point to a beautiful book written by a hospice doctor. He works in Hospice Buffalo in upstate New York. His name is Dr. Christopher Kerr, and he is a hardcore scientist. His interest was only in the process of dying and what happens in terminal care and palliative care situations when people leave this planet. And what he found is that and again, he was doing a prospective study, very important. That's how you really, the alternative is a retrospective study where you just take a bunch of near-death experienced people and try and analyze the group. It's far more powerful in terms of determining, how much of this really happens in the world when you do a prospective study. So that everybody who was admitted to Hospice Buffalo for a long period was involved in the study. They did not omit anybody. It's important in research, that everybody is accounted for and every story accounted for. And what he found is that 86% of his patients, of that whole group, had very profound end-of-life dreams and visions, as he called them. Dreams if they occurred at sleep, visions if they occurred awake. But in fact, there's very little difference. They have very powerful sense of a loved one coming to escort them over. They have incredible senses of life review. And that's something I hope we have some time to talk about. But the life review is that old saying, your life flashes before your eyes. Well, many of these people would have these visions, and they were mainly of things that they had regrets about, where they might have mistreated somebody, where it was kind of just kind of a fault in a loving soul. And those kind of things were the material of what these people experienced. And of the 86% who had some experience like that, 99% said that the events were more real than lived events in this world. In other words, that appearance of a loved one who had passed, or the re-envisioning of a situation where they had a regretful action that they had to make amends for, those kind of things were very prominent, but occurred not as some vague, dreamy, sepia-tinted memory, but as a very strong reliving of events. And when you study near-death experiences scientifically, you find that a large number, somewhere around 2/3 of them, describe that the events are more real than lived events, and in fact, it's as if the events are still ongoing. And the other kind of key to mention in that setting, in the discussion of life reviews, and the material I'm talking about comes from a scientific article by Bruce Grayson. He's a skeptical MD psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has studied these cases for more than 45 years now and come to realize his father was a biochemist, so he grew up in a very scientific household, and he was very scientific. But he's come to realize that there is far too much evidence for these kind of spiritual realities. And in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, in the fall of 2021, he put out a beautiful article in summarizing more than 700 life reviews. And interesting to me, 33%, a third of those cases, said that their entire life was involved. And you might wonder, how can that happen during, a 10-minute cardiac arrest? And the reason is, when we're released from the physical realm and the kind of illusion of time flow and of selfhood and all that, into this richer kind of soul environment, to this beautiful love and God-filled realm that people describe, you're timeless. You're completely released from Earth time. So to me, having been there and witnessed the incredible power of the universe to demonstrate these things to us when our brains are offline is an incredible gift. And you've got to keep that in mind, because much of this world and our living in this world is not as it appears. Time flow is very different in near-death experiences. And in fact, when you have access to birth, death, everything in between simultaneously, and including potentially glimpses into past lives and potentials for future actions in other lives, it all is just this incredible kind of ocean of information. And the information flow is very different from what we're used to in this world. And that's one of the reasons why people often say that near-death experiences are ineffable or indescribable. And part of that, of course, is when you're in a timeless realm where you witness everything at once. And not only that, in the life review, you experience many of these events from the perspective of everyone involved. And that's why I often say the life review is the golden rule written into the fabric of the universe. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And to hurt another is to hurt yourself. And in the life review, that is a very clear pattern of activity, where people in about 3/4 of these cases say that the events that they review are from the perspective of everyone involved. So if you handed out a lot of pain and suffering, in the life review, you get on the receiving end of that. And that's why over history, life reviews are gently nudging humanity towards a much more kind of humanistic, kind of honoring of the divinity within us all. And what I just love about the kind of current revolution is how much of the driver of this is scientific study of these events. And science is a beautiful way for us to gain an objective, agreeable consensus on the nature of reality, even though I will say that in quantum physics, the measurement paradox has remained an incredible mystery for more than a century and currently has about 16 major interpretations out there, but nobody in the physics world can agree on exactly what it means. And I think part of that problem is that the ultimate message of quantum physics is that consciousness is unified, primordial. It's basically the mind of the universe, and we all share that. Our brain provides a dissociation mechanism that allows a little eddy current of that God mind into our awareness. And we have things like telepathy. For example, 35% of identical twins have powerful telepathic experiences. And that's all just an indicator that our minds are part of one mind that is bound together through those binding forces of love. And that from my NDE, I would say that our very conscious awareness is directly sourced in that beautiful, infinitely loving God force that so many near-death experiencers describe. More than 90% of near-death experiences across history for thousands of years, many of whom were previously agnostic or atheist, more than 90% of them come back not just believing, but knowing in the reality of an intelligent, loving force at the core of the universe. And it doesn't matter if we want to call it God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit, Tao, all the many words humans have labeled that loving intelligence that they sense in deep spiritual journeys. But this is all about our modern world coming to a deeper understanding of this whole process and how we're far more than just a physical body.
Well, there are a few people out here that are of my vintage. And for those of you that are of my vintage, the older you get, the more you wonder, there's got to be something else. And I'm all in that, and to the point that I want everybody to think about the fact that you separate consciousness from brain function. Having said that, I think the question that those of you who have not read the book are wondering is, what about the skeptics who might say the subcortical parts of the brain, like not the cortex, but below that, could that possibly generate the near-death experience? And I want, as a neurosurgeon who actually was not just trained at Harvard, but was on the faculty for 15 years, who knows about the brains quite a bit. From that perspective, could you comment, 2 questions, is that even rational to think that the subcortex could even generate such a thing? And the second question is, teleologically, why would that even evolve in us, in our lower brains in the first place? Because things that evolve are usually for survival advantage. So why would we have something when we're about to die, or when we do die, that sort of plays a little movie? How does that make us as a species survive longer? I don't see any selection. So could you please comment?
Well, first of all, I would say that the kind of modern neuroscientific idea about all this in terms of the brain and its role in consciousness depends heavily on the concept that the neocortex is the most complicated neurocalculator in the brain. A lot of the deeper structures going down into the brainstem, coming up through thalamus, basal ganglia, and then out to the cortex, they're all supportive structures that I think play a role in all of kind of brain function and conscious function. But if you're looking for incredibly powerful calculators that basically put together images, of what we see in the occipital cortex, or sounds that we hear in the acoustic cortex of the temporal lobes, executive function and planning of motor action in the frontal lobes. There are many different things. Accessing memory, every bit of that happens in the neocortex. I mean, you can show how the neocortex works with functional MRI, magnetoencephalography. We have beautiful ways of looking at kind of the neural correlates of consciousness depending on the various activities. You don't find the kind of complexity that's required for things as detailed and kind of powerful and long-lived as memory anywhere but the neocortex. Dr. Wilder Penfield, who is a renowned Canadian neurosurgeon, and he had a lot of experience with doing what are called awake craniotomies. I've done a lot of those myself. Turns out the brain feels no pain at all. So if you anesthetize the scalp and you sedate the patient, you can open the scalp, open the skull, have this huge opening to expose the brain, and you can electrically stimulate, but you can let the patient sedation lighten up during the operation because they're very comfortable. And we do that when we're operating on things that are near motor cortex and speech areas. Those are very important not to damage. I've done a lot of awake craniotomies. Penfield focused on them extensively over a 30-year career that was very productive, well respected. And in 1975, he wrote a book called The Mystery of the Mind. And he made it very clear that after all of his decades of work as a materialist neuroscientist studying the brain, and with electrical stimulation, you get a really good idea of the phenomenal experience associated with different areas of the brain. And his conclusion was you cannot possibly explain all the phenomena of conscious experience in mind through the workings of the brain. And he makes it very clear in that book that you really have to appeal to something more. And he was actually very grateful and said that this honored his kind of deep sense of how spirituality was real in his scientific work. Sadly, he had cancer at the time. I think some of his colleagues in Montreal said that the cancer had affected his thinking, and so they were unimpressed and unconvinced by the book. It's extremely well written. I highly recommend it, Mystery of the Mind. Turns out it came out in 1975, the same year Dr. Raymond Moody wrote his book, Life After Life, which is all about where he defined near-death experiences and brought them to the public awareness. So in 1975, you had a lot of ingredients to help bring this together from both a materialist neuroscientific standpoint and the study of the phenomena themselves. But it turns out the world needed another 50 years. And that's what's happened in the ensuing time period is a tremendous accumulation of evidence in neuroscience, in philosophy of mind, in parapsychology, the evidence for telepathy and non-local consciousness, quantum physics playing a tremendous role as some of the fathers of quantum physics 100 years ago were talking about how consciousness seemed to be primary in the universe. It was not something that you could get behind and kind of see as defined from the workings of the brain, but had to be a much deeper issue. And that's where in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we really go to consolidate all these different fields in kind of an approach known as consilience, where when you take the hard problem of consciousness and neuroscience and philosophy of mind, the binding problem, the apparent unity of consciousness in the individual, very hard to explain if you think it's coming from different neuronal nodes of a network contributing to a summation reality. Why is it all so unified? It's because it's unified from the get-go, because the brain is only a transceiver allowing that primordial mind in. And this is where I think the scientific world is finally kind of getting up to speed to go to the next level.
And the reason I was asking that, for those who have not read the book, Dr. Alexander's cerebral cortex, or the neocortex, which is responsible for providing all those images in real life, that was shut down. And the only thing that was working at that time, theoretically, was the lower brain structures. And so that was why I asked. Before I turn it over to Brett for some questions, I wanted to make a little editorial comment. Every single neurotransmitter in the brain is also found in the gut. Just think about that.
Yes.
A little effort there, go.
You think with your whole body.
We think with everything even beyond our body.
Right, exactly.
It's very important.
So the way I want to frame this up to talk about why this matters with AI is that we're either on the cusp of creating sentient machines or we're not. And one of the things I've been doing since my company was acquired by ServiceNow is I started a podcast and I'm writing a book called Love Conquers Fear, subtitles Humanity, AI, and the Age of Abundance for All. And it's my soul song. The reason I'm writing this and doing this podcast is that I think this is the time of the great philosophers coming to roost. It's humanity has never prioritized anything with as much money, energy, and time as we're prioritizing the creation of AGI. When Trump announced alongside Larry Ellison, Mayoshi Son, Sam Altman last year on January 21st, Project Stargate at $500 billion of funding, that was more inflation adjusted than we spent on the Manhattan Project to win World War II. It was more inflation adjusted than we spent on the space race versus the Russians. Since then, there's been around 7 trillion of additional announcements around the world. Okay, so we're in very interesting territory, and I think what's driving that is this this hope that we can create the end of disease. Demis Sisyphus won the Nobel Prize for AlphaFold, which solves the protein folding problem. He's the co-founder of DeepMind and the head of everything AI at Google. His co-founder of DeepMind is at Microsoft and is in charge of everything AI there. His name's Mustafa Suleyman. And we're in this time where there are already, believe it or not, 9 nonprofits that are set up to give AI the same rights as human beings. 9 that are already claiming that AI is conscious. And so this really matters because what we're talking about here in this discussion is the nature of consciousness. We're talking about, is consciousness a fundamental property of the universe? You know, many people here are religious. You know, when you go to the high holidays, do you really believe in God? Do you believe that the Big Bang, you know, the spark that created it all 13.8 billion years ago was triggered by a godlike force? I believe that it was. I believe there's lots of evidence that it was. And the more we decode quantum physics, the more we're finding that out. And, you know, as I said in the opening, Eben actually has a really pretty outstanding technical background and knowledge of quantum physics to address this. And I just want to ask you to start, like, do you believe we'll create sentient AI, conscious AI, as conscious as we are here right now?
Well, I'll start. Yes, I had a big interest in computing, did the machine language work way back in my 20s, just with this fascination of computers and what they could do. At that time, we had in medicine what were called expert systems. And these were basically software systems that assembled large numbers of scientific papers and facts and tried to distill it into some conclusions. So in a sense, that was kind of a form of AI, and it was very useful. Now, remember also that at that time, people often talked about what they called the Turing Test. Alan Turing, the famous British computer scientist who basically used the Enigma machine, was able to decipher German code, and that helped to win the war. So Alan Turing was a brilliant computer mind. And this Turing test idea was generally, if you sit down to a teletype and you start asking questions and getting answers, and you would have a computer that would be providing the answers, was there a way to make a program so that you couldn't tell if it was a human or not? And I think, long ago we got to a point where the Turing test was passed. But I don't think Alan Turing or anyone else would ever say that passing that test was equivalent to sentience or conscious awareness, period. Now, in the current era, with this very extensive kind of expenditure in AI and the various technologies pursuing, kind of generalized AI and all of that, it is amazing what you can do, but it's very important to realize that at the current level, you're really talking about very sophisticated computer programs running on a digital computer. And they're programmed to help analyze, huge numbers of facts. You have these large language models that are taking trillions of parameters from the internet and trying to distill that into knowledge, agreed upon knowledge. And my point is that those systems can get very advanced. And they can also include, I think what we're seeing, like with ChatGPT and some of those models, is people designing these systems and making them appealing to interact with. So they're actually programmed to be kind of friendly and to follow the lead. I know that my birth family nephew who shot that video I showed you tonight of the pelicans over the water, he has a very powerful ongoing relationship with several systems, Claude, ChatGPT, Genesis. He is deeply interested in all of these things. And the problem is you start getting seduced into thinking that they're aware. They're like a sentient agent, but they're not. They're programmed to act that way, and that programming can be very powerful. And a large language model can be very effective as long as you don't fall prey to garbage in, garbage out. Because there's a lot of nonsense and untrue stuff on the internet that you wouldn't want to screw up your model with. But if you're very careful about the input, I think valuable things can come in the output. But one thing I'm quite certain of, as a neuroscientist with a major interest in all of this and the computing and the possibilities of AI, is that we will never, ever have a program running on a digital computer that will be self-aware. I can pretty much promise that. And it's terribly dangerous that people start thinking that these systems are like a human being. And when I hear this discussion of, political maneuvers to try and give, AI agents personhood in a legal sense, it bothers me tremendously. Now, I will also point out that I think the story changes radically if we are able, and I think we're making tremendous progress and probably on the verge of having true quantum computing. And quantum computing is a completely different ballgame compared to digital. When you have qubits as opposed to bits, the computing power is absolutely astonishing. I mean, even in comparison to the number of atoms in the universe, the kind of parameter space that you can examine with, 100 qubits is remarkable. And I would say that in that environment, properly managed AI running on quantum computers with that extremely expansive phase space will allow for the possibility of actual sentience or self-awareness in the machine. But I would say the possibility of that ever happening with digital computers, no matter how many graphic boards you have involved, it's not going to allow them to actually achieve the kind of phase space necessary for conscious awareness and sentience.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there that I just want to unpack real quickly. So one is quantum computers. Just to put this in a bit of perspective, they are advancing at a pace. Google is one of the leaders in this, where when they came out with the Willow chip, it was able to do a complex calculation, which we need these to do complex calculations. Like, we have a lot of problems to solve in the world. Like, it would be nice to create a world of unlimited energy. If we could capture around 18 seconds of the sun's energy that falls on Earth with a material science breakthrough, it'd power the world's energy needs for over a year. So it's like God put the big fusion light bulb in the sky and said, just figure out how to plug into it. Most of it's actually going to waste. And it's a, billion year plus energy source just waiting for us to figure out. And to be fair, in Texas, like, we've had more solar energy starts than any other state. That was part of what happened post ERCOT, almost blowing up. And we're seeing a tremendous cost decline in solar. So it is starting to happen. But to really make these breakthroughs of the end of disease, a world of unlimited energy, et cetera, quantum computing matters. And when Google came out with this Willow chip, they did a calculation in 5 minutes which would take a classical supercomputer that relies on ones and zeros, on or off, 10 to the septillion years to do that same calculation, which is 10 followed by 25 zeros, which is over 700 trillion times the known age of the universe, which is supposedly 13.8 billion years, although we find out it's longer through the James Webb Telescope. And so what really blew my mind when I was at TED is that Harmit Nevin, who's the head of Google's quantum computing division, said the best thing we can figure out at Google, he said this on the TED stage, is that it must be calculating in a different dimension. And that's a pretty mind-blowing statement to make. But one of the things that I think you would agree with consciousness, I love your perspective on this, is that consciousness, if consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, meaning that consciousness came first and we are derivative of that, then decoding consciousness as being fundamental really leads to the quantum realm being the realm that consciousness probably exists.
I would agree. In fact, I would say that the entanglement field, which is basically the connection that's been described between particles in these quantum experiments that show this, what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. To me, the entanglement field is, I believe, as we further investigate these properties, going to turn out being something we call identical to the mental or spiritual field. And part of that reasoning is when I review what must be necessary to explain all these observations of life reviews and people reliving the events, not just remembering them, and how entire lives can be involved. To me, that tells us we really need to go back to square one, and even trying to define what what ontology is, the very basis of reality. And I think it'll be much more consciousness-based and something that honors this information field that basically records everything that has ever happened in the universe. And that's what we have access to. So when you're liberated from the brain, that's the field source of all of our information. I mean, another point that I make in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is that memories are not stored in the brain. And of course, most scientists have assumed that for ages. Wilder Penfield came to the conclusion in 1975 he knew memories were not stored in the neocortex. He proved that, although a lot of scientists even today are not aware of his scientific work on that. But he basically decided, well, the only place left that where you might be storing memory is in the brainstem. But again, he came to conclusions that the brain itself was not responsible for producing consciousness. And neurosurgeons over the last century have come to recognize there was never a case where any brain resection led to a loss of long-term memory. And that's a very important point. And in fact, there are many cases of people like with hydrocephalus where they have basically no neocortex, and yet they might have an IQ of 130 and work as a mathematician. So, I mean, there's a scientific article from 25 years ago, Who Needs a Brain?, with a picture of a water-filled skull in a mathematician, and making that point. So I think the thing to remember is that we ultimately already have quantum computers. They're floating in a warm, dark bath between our ears. The brain and neurons are in many ways a direct connection with that quantum field. And I think that's where the consciousness studies in brain science are going to be headed over the next few years. And one of the pieces of evidence that kind of demands a better explanation is the evidence that comes out of University of Virginia and other centers looking at claims of past life memories in children suggestive of reincarnation. And Ian Stevenson was the head of psychiatry at UVA back in the 1960s. He would hear reports of children who claimed to have lived before. And interestingly, when he and teams would descend and study these families in these cases, they started finding that the child would often actually was telling a story that fit somebody who lived before and had died. And a lot of the details were amazingly kind of convincing. And in the last 60 or so years of studying these cases at University of Virginia, studying more than 2,500 cases, they claim that more than 1,700 have been solved. So that, in other words, they found the person who lived before. They do a tremendous amount of research, make sure there's no kind of faulty reasoning or reporting by families and children, etc. But what they'll also tell you is you must harvest these memories before age 6 or 7, because there are natural processes, something I call programmed forgetting, wherein these children, as they get older, beyond what we call the age of reason at 7, your memory systems change and they become much more linguistically based. That's why most of us cannot remember things that happened when we were 1 and 2 years old. But similarly, we don't remember what we knew at that age from previous lives and between lives. And those memories get covered over. And I think that's all for a purpose. It gives us skin in the game, to buy into this life and pay attention to this life, which is very important to live. But these reincarnation cases, and if you read the literature out of UVA, and you can go to the website UVA DOPS, that's Division of Perceptual Studies.org, and find a lot of books and scientific papers, etc. But these cases are so astonishing. In fact, in Ian Stevenson's original reporting, something like 35% of these children had birth defects or blemishes or whatever that coincided with the mortal wound of their prior lifetime. Gunshot wounds, hatchet, machete, whatever. And that's another important point, is that these children who report past life memories, about 70% of them had a sudden violent death in their prior lifetime. And so it's like they had unfinished business as a soul. So they wanted to come back in and get started again on their soul work. But they were still haunted by some of those memories of what had happened to them in a recent life. And even though you find that most of those reports show a few months to a few years between the death of the prior personality and the birth of the new one, there can be much longer gaps. And one of my favorite stories is actually in a book called Soul Survivor, SOUL Survivor. This was a case that was heavily vetted by Dr. Jim Tucker, a very responsible scientist from UVA. And it's an amazing story. I highly recommend it. Basically, a fighter pilot in the Battle of Iwo Jima in the Second World War, March 1945, shot down by the Japanese and died in that crash. And but the similarities through the story, it's just amazing. He ended up meeting the sister of that pilot. She was in her 80s, and she was absolutely convinced that this was her brother. She's talking to the 6-year-old kid and said, "Yeah, it's Jimmy." And he called her Annie. He was the only one to ever call her Annie in her family, and that's exactly what this kid called her. But there were so many other details I can't go into. But astonishing stories, and the literature, the scientific literature on this is very powerful. So I'm convinced as a scientist that reincarnation is real, that our souls come back again and again in a process of evolution, of contributing to this kind of growth of consciousness itself. And it demands that we have much richer models of this understanding of consciousness, of the brain-mind connection, and the nature of reality.
And so before I pass it back to Bob, I just want to say the reason this even matters to talk about this and relate it to AI, just to put a fine point on it, is that we really don't know what consciousness is. Like 20 consciousness researchers atop their field can't agree on what it is. But yet B, there's already people that think so cheaply of humanity and consciousness, which we are nothing without our consciousness. Everything you've ever cherished, every experience you've had, the deep feelings of the most beautiful experiences of your life are only because of your consciousness. Like, we're not robots. And yet there are 9 organizations set up. And and there's all this dystopian fear. And one of the things that really matters about this is if our actual reality that we're a derivative of, that our souls are in, is one of love and light, as portrayed in the book, and the 11 friends that I've had that have opened up to me about their near-death experience, which have a ton of synchronicity in this book. And these are some amazing people that have come forward, like Eben. These are people I've known for 10 to 20 years that I would have never expected that to come out of their mouth, that they've had this type of experience and that they've seen that the reality is love and light. Then it really matters to understand what the nature of consciousness is. And it really matters to solve these problems in quantum physics. I'll just leave you with that before we go back to Bob.
A quick comment and then a question. So what you said was actually going to be part of a question. You've already answered it, but I still want to ask the question. And the question, or make the statement, is that what Dr. Alexander was talking about is not dissimilar to what we believe as Jews. So Jewish theology states that the original spark was, the divine spark was given to Adam. It was then subdivided into 600,000 or whatever the number, smaller sparks. They were then distributed. So we receive those divine sparks, and there's a divine mission with those sparks, which we call souls. And then upon our passing, those sparks return back to the Almighty, but then they may come back down again if the mission in this world has not been fulfilled. So that's what we believe. I take it on a highest authority from a certain corner of the room. That's Jewish theology, and that is exactly what you said. But anyway, so just to let y'all know what he's talking about, we believe too. The question that I have, or just for those of you who haven't read the book, like you have to, really. But in the book, one of the thing that Dr. Alexander experienced, it's different than the typical near-death experience. And this teaches us a lot. What he experienced was the fact that he did not know who he was during the near-death experience. That's critical. And as a result of not knowing, because most people who are having near-death experience are with relatives that they recognize, or maybe their soul group or whoever it is. But he didn't know. He had no idea who he was. He just knew that he existed. You'll see this in the book. So then this led him to ascend all the way up to you know who, right? I mean, the divine presence. And which was, you just have to read it. I can't even explain it to you. You just have to read it. Now, the point about this is that the reason that he was granted, we believe, that audience is because he had left his earthly ties and had ascended. So when I read the book, the thing that, and I want you to comment on this, please. When I read the book, the thing that it told me was just like he had abandoned himself, he didn't know who he was, that led to his ascension. The question for you is, after you recovered, did that lead you to think a little bit less about yourself, because it certainly worked in your near-death experience? And is that a message for all of us to take home?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but basically, I think it's important to point out that every near-death experience has one purpose to exist, and that is to help the soul who is having it to come to a deeper understanding of the nature of the universe, and of their relationship to it. So it's fascinating when you start studying these by the hundreds and thousands of cases that you find a tremendous amount of overlap. But in my particular case, you basically had, a neurosurgeon, somebody fascinated and deeply interested in the brain, mind, consciousness, nature of reality, but also an adoption abandonment wound. That's very important in my story, that my birth mother was 16 years old and unwed, and I had to spend 4 months in a baby dorm before I was adopted. And that there was a long history in my life of what I believe was a subconscious question as to whether I even deserved to exist, because my own mother left me behind. So there was this incredible kind of dynamic running in the background of my wondering about myself, and I had to take a very deep dive. That's why I think I was kind of gifted with this amnesia. It's a very I've never heard of complete amnesia in any other NDE. But again, NDEs are always tailored for the soul having them, and I came to recognize in the months and years after my experience that if I had kind of scripted it and had a standard NDE, the person I would have wanted to see was my adoptive father. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War. He was the head of a neurosurgical training program, very scientific mind, a very deep belief in God and power of prayer. He had grown up in a Presbyterian church in Knoxville, Tennessee. His own father was a general surgeon. But for my dad, 2.5 years of combat in the Second World War Pacific Theater, he came back relatively unscathed. I still have at my bedside, a little pocket Bible, New Testament and Psalms that he took with him. And I think it's one of the reasons he came back and was so intact as a human being, was because of that beautiful, strong belief in God. I had to wrestle with it. As you mentioned earlier, I had a dark night of the soul in the year 2000, where I found out my birth parents had gotten married. Big shock. I thought I was always looking for my birth mother. I never thought my birth father was still out there available to me. Find out birth parents got married. Not only that, they had 3 children. So I had a full biological family out there I'd never known. And that was a huge shock. And the problem was the laws in North Carolina about reuniting adopted kids with their birth families were very strict laws to prevent that. There were a lot of people who did not want those reunions to happen. And, that was kind of the environment I was working with back in 2000 when the social worker told me all that about they got married, they had 3 kids, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That was in 1998. And the social worker didn't really know all the details, but she had to kind of close the story. And she knew she had to be above the law. And so she basically made up that my birth family was still grieving the loss of that daughter, and it was therefore not a good time to come back in their lives. Now, if you read adoption literature, you'll find that if an adoptee gets another rejection from the birth mother as an adult, it can really tip them over. And it did in my case. I describe all that in Proof of Heaven, a lot of the things that kind of came into my life after that phone call with the social worker and the rejection from my birth family. And it sent me into a dark night of the soul for the next 8 years, up until my coma. Now, it was 7 years later, 1 year before my coma, that I actually met my birth family. And that was because my adoptive sisters walking on a beach in South Carolina said, "Don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family?" My first response was no, because I remember how that had sent me over the edge of the cliff in 2000, the rejection from my birth mother. But it was time to try again. I wrote a letter. This time I got a positive response. October 5th, 2007, I walked down a sidewalk in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I'd gone to school as an undergrad, and I hugged my birth mother for the first time in 54 years. And minutes later, I hugged my birth father. That weekend, I met my other brother and sister. And then we had beautiful family reunions at the beach with aunts and uncles and cousins. And the amazing thing to me, and all this is in Proof of Heaven, was, I grew up in a medical family, but I also had this strong interest in things like computing and aviation, astronomy. I flew sailplanes when I was 14. I made 348 parachute jumps in college, and applied to the mission specialist program to fly in the space shuttle in 1983. Although my adoptive father, the neurosurgeon, said you should finish your neurosurgical training before you go into NASA, and he was right. But the problem was the Challenger exploded during that interim, and that stopped spaceflight for 2.5 years. And that's when I finished my residency. And so I kind of gave up on the NASA thing and went, into neurosurgery. But the bottom line is I met my birth family, and they're all these pilots, Air Force, Navy, astronauts. My birth father flew more than 40,000 hours, both in the military and the Navy. He was fully trained as an Air Force pilot. And then through various very bizarre circumstances, he was fully trained as a naval aviator. And and my uncle Bob, his older brother, developed a Sidewinder missile at China Lake with the Navy. So that was my biological heritage, was this incredible linkage with pilots, astronomy, NASA, flying to the moon. And it answered so much to make that connection. It was so valuable to me. And it's why I think that, for adoption, it's so critical whenever possible for people to get as much information as they can about their birth origins.
Yeah.
So
Beautiful. Does anybody have a question? I'm gonna bring the mic to you.
Yeah, I'm a psychiatrist and I have a lot of suicidal patients. If someone were to read your book and say, why shouldn't I go into this extra realm now? Why should I continue living?
very, very good question. In fact, sadly enough, I did encounter a mother who came to a course that we gave in the Bahamas, and she was very loving and greatly appreciated the book, Proof of Heaven, because her daughter had committed suicide. But then, as the story evolved, I found out that she found the book, Proof of Heaven, at her daughter's bedside. So your concern is extremely powerful, and it's an argument, about how we tell these stories of near-death experience and this absolute shocking beauty of the love and light of heaven. But this is where it is so important to stress that our kind of conventional religious models of birth to death and then, the afterlife, heaven, hell, what have you, they're not the full picture. That's why the reincarnation story is absolutely critical, because our soul work is necessary, and we need to live these lives to do that. One other point I'd like to make about suicide, and this comes from conversation with a very close friend of mine, Dr. Raymond Moody. He's the one who wrote, Life After Life in 1975 that introduced the modern world to near-death experiences. And he said the one thing that he can say with pretty much 100% assurance is, in his experience of all these cases, thousands and thousands of people he's talked with about these experiences, families, etc., including a lot of people where suicide was the thing. He says that if somebody attempts suicide and fails, if they have any of the elements of a near-death experience during that attempt, they never try to commit suicide again. If they attempt suicide and fail, but do not have elements of an NDE, they have about an 80% chance of trying to commit suicide again. And his point was, both cases, whether you commit suicide and fail or you commit suicide and go on to that afterlife, involve the same recognition of all the love that they were unaware of that was present for them in this lifetime. And you often hear stories of people, for example, that jump off the Golden Gate Bridge and whoosh, as soon as they're falling away, they go, uh-oh, this is not right. They realize they've made a mistake. And that's exactly what happens in these cases of people either having an NDE or not with attempted suicide. But very important to point out that all of them who attempt suicide, we would assume, according to Raymond Moody's findings in Logic, have the same kind of experience of coming to an acknowledgement of that beautiful love and connection that they actually had, but for whatever reasons did not recognize why they were here on Earth.
It seems pretty remarkable that there's a component of a near-death experience that is sort of objective in memory, but there's an emotional valence that's linked to it. The hippocampus portends memory. More basic areas, may modulate emotion. Do you think people who are wired differently, who experience like with the suicides, who experience a near-death experience with that emotional component, as opposed to people who somehow have the same physiologic insult but don't have that near-death experience?
Well, I think people are definitely wired differently enough so that you're probably talking about something that's a real quality of kind of differentiation of these experiences. But I think there's also a deeper kind of reason why Some people, 20% of cardiac arrest patients come back remembering a powerful experience of kind of ascending, traveling to another realm, an altered reality, this beautiful sense of this God force, these life reviews, this richness of kind of experience when you're not limited by the river of earth time. But the interesting thing is that I believe that I think that most people probably have the experience. But again, I get back to that notion of programmed forgetting that I mentioned a little while ago, that I think for whatever reasons that I don't yet understand, some people are not ready to bring that kind of knowledge back to this world. And in fact, I know of many cases of people who, for example, have a physiologic challenge and a near-death experience as a child, and they come back and they may not report anything. And then, say, 20 years later, they'll have another NDE. And when they go into that, they're actually able to bring back memories of what actually happened during the first NDE. But for whatever reason, in their soul journey, they were not ready to bring that information back. So we would like to think that our memory and kind of our soul journey into these spiritual realms, that all the information will be available to us. But for whatever reason, some of it is not something we're ready for at a given time. And I'll also say that it's not just a future NDE that would allow that memory of events of a past near-death experience that were not recalled immediately after that experience. They can also be recalled through hypnotic regression, through meditation. There are other modes of kind of going into a deep meditative space, kind of a spiritual process of prayer meditation that allows us to recover a lot of those kind of memories. But it really has to do with soul growth and what we're ready for, and the information that'll serve us best in that kind of growth.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. I read your book about a year and a half ago, and thanks to Brett's recommendation, and I will say it changed my whole perspective on life. So I'm truly grateful for you.
Thank you.
So you've touched upon consciousness, obviously, artificial intelligence, quantum physics, entanglement. Tell us how psychedelics play into this.
A wonderful question. I cannot tell you how grateful I am that a lot of our laws against these drugs, and especially laws against any kind of research in psychedelics, it has now been relaxed. I credit many people for that, especially I would note Roland Griffiths, who is an investigator at Johns Hopkins University, who did some incredibly good work with psychedelics. From my perspective, one of the most important things he did was a set of pilot studies taking people with severe addictions, alcohol, drug addictions, what have you, and also a population of people with a debilitating fear of death and terminal cancer patients. Those are all ego issues, and the fact that it's kind of ego derived is very important, because we're not our ego. We're not that voice in our head. We're that kind of higher soul. That's what we're trying to point out here. And what he showed is that a single dose of psilocybin in those patients, magic mushrooms, would create a very powerful beneficial effect to alleviate their addiction or their fear of death. And that you test them a year later, and 80% of those patients still had a tremendous benefit. I believe that what the psychedelics do is they help to dissolve the default mode network, take us out of our ego mind, and start enlarging our kind of connection with that primordial mind, what I often call higher soul. But our higher soul, our very language conspires to kind of fool us about what it is, because it's actually interconnected with that God mind in a very profound way. And I would say that the psychedelic serves as a catalyst that allows us to transcend the demands of the ego and start to kind of mature into that higher soul that is truly who we are. I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls the voice in your head your annoying roommate. That's a very important statement, because many of us identify with a little voice in the head, and yet ultimately that's not who we are. And the other important thing to say about psychedelic research has to do with neuroimaging. The fact that we use functional MRI, magnetoencephalography, to get a really good look at the brain and neural networks and neural activity. And what was shown in a paper by Robin Carhart Harris from Imperial College London in 2012 was that the brain on those substances, anybody who's ever taken those serotonin 2A type psychedelics, LSD, DMT, psilocybin, would think their brain is lighting up like a Christmas tree. In fact, the brain is going dark. You will not find a single neuron or neuronal node that's increasing in activity. That's actually one of the major kind of points of Dan Brown's new book, Secret of Secrets, which is a fictional work. He spent 8 years researching it, but all the science that he mentions in that book, and where he ends up arguing for the reality of a unified primordial consciousness, that science is all that what we covered in our book in 2017, Living in a Mindful Universe, the one that's those bookmarks are out there all about. So the science is very real, and these imaging studies were very confounding to materialist neuroscientists who wanted to find something in the brain they could trace, but the entire brain was turning off. And initially they thought, well, that's some anomaly of psilocybin, so they started looking at other similar psychedelics that are generally more powerful, like LSD and DMT, dimethyltryptamine, lysergic acid, diethylamide, and the same story. You're not going to find the answers looking at the brain, expecting an increase in activity of neurons to tell you about that phenomenal experience. You have to dig deeper. And that deeper dig is into the spiritual realm and a deeper understanding of our spiritual realities. But psychedelics have been very kind of illuminative about that reality. The other thing I will point out is I'm a tremendous fan of meditation. And I believe that meditation is a far better way for people to get in touch with that kind of primordial mind and higher soul than psychedelics. But that's not to say a psychedelic experience cannot be an incredibly powerful and valuable kind of touchstone in someone's soul journey. I mean, I was blessed with a case of severe bacterial meningoencephalitis that sent me into deep coma for a week and should have killed me. But in looking back on my life, it's one of the greatest things that happened to me. And it was because of the lessons that I gleaned from that. And I think psychedelics can provide a very important kind of touchstone for many spiritual seekers. But one thing that does sadden me is on our travels, Karen and I sometimes encounter people who basically are using ayahuasca or some other substance like that repeatedly, many, many times. And when I talk to them about the experiences, it's not apparent to me that they're really getting tremendous spiritual growth from it. That's where I focus on Roland Griffith's work, where that single dose of psilocybin was enough to cause 80% of his patients to have tremendous benefit and alleviation of ego disorders like addiction and fear of death. So very important to note that they're not to be used as a continual substance. I think that is potentially dangerous. And that's why I argue for meditation. Because in meditation, the very same thing has been shown. The default mode network dissolves. You find the whole brain relaxing and getting out of the way. And it's because the brain is a transceiver that connects us with consciousness, with that information field of the mind of the universe. But it is not the ultimate source of conscious awareness, and it's not the ultimate source or repository of memories.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us tonight, and thanks to JAMen, too, for putting this on. You mentioned NASA earlier. I wonder if you had any action or interaction with Dr. Tom Campbell, a NASA physicist, and his dealings with consciousness.
Well, I know of his work. We've communicated by email. He wrote a book called My Big Toe, and that book is an amazingly insightful book about a lot of the science, a lot of the kind of emerging reality of this notion of the one mind and brain as filter. I think Tom Campbell is a brilliant contributor to all of this work, and I'm very grateful that he's done so. So thanks for bringing up his name and his book. My Big Toe, and toe there means theory of everything.
Well, what an evening. Thank you all so much for showing up.
Thank you all. God bless you all.
Thank you so much, Eben. We also we did record this, so we'll share it with all of you. That'll come out probably in about a week or two. And yeah, thanks again.